If you've spent any decent amount of time around my channel, you've probably realized by now that I've played a stupid amount of video games in my life. The main reason that I've been able to fit in so many and develop such a wide range of experience within the art form is because I started at an incredibly young age, with my dad handing his consoles and games down to me when I was just 3 years old. This was an incredibly irresponsible move on his part looking back on it, as all of his games were ones meant for, well, not 3-year-olds. And the reason I'm opening this video by telling you all this is because the very first game I ever played, at an age so young that I can hardly remember it, was the original Resident Evil for Sony's PlayStation. This game would be the catalyst for my entire love of the medium, and would also make a lifelong fan out of me, as Resident Evil is, to this day, my favorite gaming franchise of all time. So when I recently asked you guys what you would like to see me cover here on the channel, and Resident Evil got more votes than anything else, to say I was a little excited would be a bit of an understatement. So today, we're starting what will inevitably be a very long journey to play and review every single Resident Evil game to see how the series changed over time. And there's no better place to start than with the same original title that I did all those years ago. Resident Evil is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation in March of 1996. It was inspired by an earlier Capcom horror game called Sweet Home, which itself was a video game adaptation of a Japanese horror film by the same name. Capcom had originally intended to do a straight-up remake of Sweet Home, but it eventually ended up becoming its own thing entirely under the direction of a now legendary game director, Shinji Mikami. Mikami was actually appointed as the director of this project because he was known around the Capcom office to be a big old scaredy cat, so he was put onto it since if anyone would know what was and wasn't actually scary, it would be him. But Chol, I hear you ask, what's the basic story setup for the game? Well, hypothetical viewer asking a hypothetical question, in Resident Evil, we play as either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, depending on which character the player chooses at the start of the game. There's been a series of brutal murders recently in the mountains of a quiet Midwestern town, so the local police send in a squad of their Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or S.T.A.R.S for short. However, this squad goes missing shortly after being sent in to investigate, so playing as either Chris or Jill, we're sent in after them to rescue the missing Bravo team, as well as help with the investigation if we can. Shortly after arriving in the mountains, we find the remains of the Bravo team's helicopter before being attacked by a group of wild dogs. In the panic, our helicopter pilot takes off without us, and we, along with a handful of other Alpha Team members, are chased into a nearby mansion to escape from the dogs. Regardless of which character you play as, you'll end up being separated from at least one of the other surviving Alpha Team members during your escape. So from here, our goal is to find said member, as well as find a safe way out of the mansion that doesn't involve being mauled to death by a group of savage canines. So in typical horror movie fashion, we split up and start searching around the mansion separately, and it only takes a couple minutes before we're greeted by this iconic scene. So now we're not just stuck in an old creepy mansion, we're stuck in an old creepy mansion with zombies wandering around. Great. We manage to escape from the zombie, but when we do, the other surviving members of Alpha Team are no longer anywhere to be found, leaving us completely on our own. But with the basic story setup out of the way, let's get into the real meat of Resident Evil, that being the gameplay. The biggest thing that keeps people away from trying out these old RE games, or at least the one that I hear people say keeps them away the most, is the control scheme. See, Resident Evil uses tank controls. This means that by pressing up or down on the D-pad, your character will move forward or backward relative to the direction they're facing. Pressing left or right on the D-pad will simply rotate your character to the left or to the right, once again, relative to the direction they're facing. A lot of people who try to get into these games for the first time nowadays tend to say that it would have been better to just have the character move relative to the direction of the camera rather than the direction they're facing, but I couldn't disagree more. The designers decided to use this control scheme because it felt much more natural in a game with fixed camera angles. Using tank controls means that anytime the camera angle changes, the direction the player character is moving in will remain completely unchanged. Whereas if the controls worked relative to the direction of the camera, you'd have the character suddenly change direction every single time the camera angle changes. I have played some other games that make use of fixed camera angles and have the character control relative to the camera, and yeah, it's always a little awkward and janky when the camera angle changes. And I know that this might sound a little hard to believe when it's coming from someone who's literally played these games for his entire life, but if you spend even just an hour or two playing the game for yourself, you'll get used to the tank controls pretty quickly and they'll feel natural to you in no time. Speaking of the fixed camera angles though, they're probably my favorite part of Resident Evil's presentation. These angles are often used to build extra tension or hide things just out of sight from the player. For example, placing a zombie around a corner and allowing the player to hear it wandering around, but not see it until they take the leap of faith to actually round the corner for themselves and see what the sound is. They also give the game this incredibly cinematic flair and make it almost feel like you're playing out some sort of interactive horror movie. And man, when I tell you that the designers used these camera angles to set up some really effective scares, I mean it. And I know what some of you are thinking. But Chol, you said this was a PlayStation game from 1996. How does it manage to look this good despite its age and the hardware it's running on? Well, dear viewer, the answer to that is just as simple as it is interesting. Thanks to the game's use of fixed camera angles, the designers realized that there was a little trick they could pull to maximize the game's visual fidelity and performance. That trick being that they actually used pre-rendered backgrounds to make up the majority of what you see in every single shot of the game. So what they've done is made a render of what they wanted each shot to look like, then simply exported those files out as 2D image files. They would then slap those images into the game and make 3D spaces based off of what the 2D image looked like, with things like invisible boundaries to prevent you from walking through the walls or falling through the floor. As a result, these 2D images are able to give the player the illusion of running around within a 3D space, when really they're just running around on this plane on top of a picture. So the player, the enemies, and any interactive objects are actually the only 3D models on the screen that the PlayStation would ever need to be rendering, and everything else in the background is just a simple image. This allowed them to put all of the console's horsepower towards rendering just those few models, allowing them to be much more detailed than other games of the time. And it also has this nice additional effect of making those 3D objects really pop and stand out compared to everything in the background, especially if you're upscaling the game like I did when recording for this video. Additionally, the designers wanted to find some way to make transitions between rooms feel more natural, as there would be pretty large stutters during the transition due to the console needing to load everything in. So they came up with something that is so simple, yet has remained iconic for nearly 30 years. These transition screens where you see the doors slowly open before you move through them are kind of genius when you think about it. Anytime you move into a new room, you see this slow, creepy transition of yourself going through the door, ensuring that the tension of the game is never lost during these short loading periods. That being said, they can be kind of annoying after you've played the game for a long time, and especially when backtracking. They're awesome when you're moving through and exploring things for the first time, but when you're trying to quickly run from one side of the mansion to the other, they can feel like they're just there to eat up some of your time. Considering the limitations of the hardware they were working with though, they were a really clever way to get around the issue of moving between rooms, so you've got to give them some credit for that. But I've rambled on about the game's presentation for long enough, so let's finally get down to the real question here. What do you actually do in Resident Evil? Well, the core gameplay loop here revolves around exploring the mansion, slowly opening up new areas and uncovering more and more of the secrets hidden within it, as well as solving puzzles and finding items that will help you survive as you go. And that whole picking up items part brings us to not just one of the core components of Resident Evil, but of the survival horror genre as a whole. There will be so many things throughout the game that you'll want to pick up, from weapons to ammo to healing items to key items that will open up more of the mansion. But you'll have to pick and choose what to pick up and when to do it, as players in this game have a very limited amount of inventory space. This also brings us to the first difference between playing as Chris or Jill, as Chris only has 6 item slots to work with, whereas Jill has a much more lenient 8. That might not sound like much of a difference to you if you haven't played the games before, but it's actually really significant. Say you're carrying a weapon, some ammo for said weapon, a healing item, and a key to open up doors with. This means that 4 of your inventory slots are already occupied, leaving Chris with only 2 slots for picking up new items he might find, and Jill with literally double the space for new items with 4 open slots. This makes playing as Jill a lot easier and more forgiving, especially for players who are new to the genre. The key to managing your inventory space effectively are the item boxes. There's no way to simply drop or discard an item in Resident Evil, so if you want to make some space in your inventory, you'll have to make your way to one of these boxes and deposit some of your items there. There are a few of these throughout the game, and it might sound like a pain in the ass to have to remember where you left all your items all the time, but every item box is actually magically connected through the power of video game logic. So if you put an item into a box on one side of the mansion, you'll still be able to pick it up from an item box on the opposite side. This makes managing your inventory space surprisingly smooth, as you really only have to worry about what items you'll need at any given time, and you can conveniently go and pick up an item you left behind whenever you need to. The only thing that's somewhat annoying about the item boxes is that items that can stack won't automatically do so when you put them inside the box. So if you have a stack of pistol ammo already in the box, but you find some more laying around the mansion, you'll have to open up the item box, remove the stack that's already in there, combine it with the new stack that you just found in your inventory, and then put it back in the box for later. It's not the end of the world or anything, but it's definitely a small quality of life thing that really could have gone a long way. But while we're on the topic of the differences between playing as Jill or Chris, I should mention that Resident Evil doesn't have a difficulty selection. At least not technically. Which character you decide to play as will drastically impact your experience in the game, with Jill essentially being the game's easy mode and Chris being the game's hard mode. The game is largely the same regardless of which character you choose, but there are small differences in both the gameplay and the story that make things feel meaningfully different. To start, both characters have a sort of partner that will show up at various points throughout the game. In Chris's campaign, you'll frequently run into Rebecca Chambers, a surviving rookie from the S.T.A.R.S Bravo team who will often find herself in bad situations that you have to bail her out of, or she'll die and be absent from the rest of your playthrough. If you play as Jill though, you'll have Barry Burton. Barry is an older member of S.T.A.R.S and much more experienced as a result. As such, he's essentially the opposite of Rebecca and will actually show up to bail the player out of a bad situation and save them. Jill will also start the game with a lockpick that doesn't take up any space in her inventory, allowing her to freely bypass simple locks throughout the entirety of the game. When playing as Chris though, you'll have to find these small one-time use keys that are scattered around the mansion that do actually take up an inventory slot if you want to open any of these same locks. These keys don't stack either, so on top of having less inventory slots, Chris also needs to use more of his slots to actually open up every room and locked drawer throughout the mansion. And beyond even that, there's how you acquire the shotgun in this game. The shotgun can be found hanging on a wall very early in the game, but when you pick it up, it triggers a mechanism that will cause the room next to it to lock you in on your way out before dropping the ceiling on you and crushing you. When playing as Chris, you'll have to play through the game with just the pistol and a knife for about a couple hours before eventually finding a broken shotgun that can be used to trick the trap and take the weapon safely. When playing as Jill though, you can go and grab the shotgun within the first 5 minutes of your playthrough, as when the trap activates, Barry will simply show up and break one of the doors down to save you from it. And to add insult to injury, Jill is also able to find a bazooka during the first hour of her playthrough that Chris is never able to find for the entirety of the game. There are more differences that we could get into, but honestly, we'd be here all day if I explained every single one of them to you guys. I think the reason that Jill's run of the game had so many adjustments made to make it easier is mainly due to the fact that Jill has a smaller health pool than Chris, meaning she dies much faster than he does when attacked by enemies. This might sound like a major downside, but Jill's campaign will actually spawn way more healing items throughout the mansion for you, and oh, there I go explaining differences again. Overall though, Jill's campaign is still significantly easier than Chris's, so if you're a new player looking to get into the game for yourself, I would definitely recommend that you start with her. Or show us those balls of steel and do a Chris playthrough on your first run, see how that goes. If you want to save your game in Resident Evil, you need to use a one-time use ink ribbon at one of the game's typewriters in order to do so. These items can be very hard to come across, especially when playing the game as Chris, as I only found 12 ink ribbons throughout the entire game during my run as Chris for this video. And when you die in Resident Evil, you won't load back to the room before the one you just died in, you'll load back to the last time you saved at a typewriter. So not saving for extended periods of time means risking the loss of more and more progress the longer you go without using one, but saving too often means you risk getting to a point where you're out of ink ribbons entirely and might not find any for a couple hours or so. It makes something as simple as saving your progress into something that you really have to think tactically about, and just raises the overall tension of the game that much more. But as a wise man once said, losing progress can only be scary if there's something looking to kill you. Resident Evil is a difficult game, even for players who are experienced with the survival horror genre. This is partially because of the limited resources that the player has to work with, but also because the enemies here are just really strong. Even the basic zombies here in RE can take anywhere from 3 to 9 shots from a pistol to actually put down, and they might even fall to the ground and try to fake you out, only to grab you by the foot and take a quick bite out of you. Not to mention that Jill can only really take 2 or 3 bites from them before dying, and Chris can't take many more, with him going down after only 3 or 4. And the zombies are the least of your problems here, because let me introduce you to the one enemy that still haunts the dreams of anyone who played this game as a kid: the Hunter. This is a reptilian monster who's been infected by the same virus as the zombies, and they're incredibly dangerous. They take a good amount of firepower to put down, even tanking multiple shots from the most powerful weapons in the game, like the bazooka or the Colt Python. But what makes them really dangerous is that goddamn leaping attack that will instantly lob your head off even at full health. They're really awesome enemies, as are all of the various monsters that you'll encounter here in Resident Evil, but man do they get infuriating when you get your head taken off by one multiple times in the exact same spot. I mean, talk about a soul-crushing loss of progress. But since the enemies are so dangerous here, it actually makes the game far more interesting than it otherwise would be. Due to how limited your resources are, every enemy you come across presents you with a very difficult decision. You can either fight the enemy, giving up a large amount of your ammo in order to make whatever room or hallway you're in safer for the rest of the game, or you could try to run by them, but then you risk losing a valuable healing item in the event you get hit by them along the way. The game straight up doesn't provide the player with enough ammunition to kill every single enemy they encounter throughout the game, so you end up with this really interesting dynamic where you need to determine which enemies you can leave alive and which ones you need to put down. On top of that, there are multiple boss fights throughout the game, and these are a bit of a mixed bag. I love them now that I can casually kill them without too much effort, but I remember being a kid and thinking that they were just impossible. And while I do think that tank controls were a good decision for the game, I don't feel like they lend themselves very well to high-stake boss encounters like these. There's no indication or warning that you'll be entering a boss fight beforehand either, so if you're playing the game for the first time, you'll end up just wandering into these without being able to go back and stock up on healing items and save your game before you go and fight them. Like I said, I love the bosses here as someone who's played the game roughly 20 times over the years, but I also distinctly remember hating them before becoming deeply familiar with the game and its mechanics. When you're not engaging in combat or running away from enemies though, you have some really amazing exploration on offer here. From the start of the game, there are multiple paths open to the player, and you can go through the mansion as you please. As you go, you'll find things like keys or other various items that allow you to access new areas, slowly opening up the mansion more and more, and ensuring that the player never runs out of new places to explore. On top of that, the level design here is genuinely fantastic. The mansion may seem like a labyrinth at the beginning, but by the end of the game, you'll probably be able to draw out a pretty good map by hand using just your memory. You'll be doing a lot of backtracking here, but it's all in service of making progress little by little, and really just allows players to become more familiar with the mansion as the game goes on. Things like item boxes and typewriters are spaced out pretty evenly too, meaning that you're never too far away from one when you need it. They're also placed in areas that you'll have to run through a lot anyway, allowing you to conveniently take a quick pit stop along the way. And as you open up more rooms within the mansion, you'll also end up coming across more notes and documents that have been left behind that detail the events leading up to our arrival. This is something that was done a lot in the RPG and immersive sim genres before Resident Evil came around, with notes like these being used as a main source of world building in a lot of iconic games from the early 90s. These do a great job of building up the mystery of what was going on in the mansion before we arrived, something that we'll circle back to soon in the spoilers section. Something else that you'll be doing a lot of in these calmer moments of the game is solving puzzles. These aren't very difficult by any means, but they're always just enough to fire up your brain for a few seconds or so to solve, and they help a ton with keeping the gameplay fresh and engaging throughout. And I seriously hope that you guys are better at these slide puzzles than I am, because holy shit, some of these are a struggle for me. What really makes the exploration feel so interesting here though, at least to me, is the incredibly unnerving atmosphere. While I've talked primarily about the mansion in this video, you do also get to explore some of the grounds surrounding the mansion, some underground caves, and even a secret basement lab by the end of the game. I wouldn't say that any of these areas are necessarily scary, but they're always just creepy enough to get under your skin a little bit, which is almost worse if you ask me. Rather than feeling outright scared the entire time, you feel just a little bit uncomfortable. And especially if you binge through the game in a short time like I did for this video, that slight unease really starts to get to you more and more over the course of a full playthrough. The music in this game plays a big role in building that atmosphere, and I genuinely think that it's one of my favorite horror soundtracks of all time. Here, take a quick listen for yourself and see what you think. And to add to that even more, there are then the moments where the music will just suddenly stop. But nothing, and I mean nothing in this game, is even close to as scary as Chris Redfield's typing skills. I mean, Jesus Christ, man, this game is supposed to take place in 1998, and the guy still hasn't bothered learning how to use a keyboard. Anyway, I mentioned a couple minutes ago that there would be a spoiler section, and we're gonna get into that now. So if you haven't played the game for yourself yet and want to avoid spoiling the story of it, here's your warning to skip to the timestamp on screen. As far as the story goes in Resident Evil, the basic concept is incredibly strong, and what you find scattered around in notes and documents is all super well written, but when it comes to the dialogue and the voice acting, well, to call it campy wouldn't do it justice.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
All of the dialogue is incredibly cheesy, and to be completely honest with you, the voice acting performances are just awful. But luckily, they're so bad that it wraps back around to legitimately being one of my favorite parts of the game.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
You're wounded.
Like, yeah, the performances are horrible, but they're just so damn charming at the same time.
Look at those monsters!
I probably quote the original Resident Evil more than any other game I've ever played, and on top of that, Barry Burton might just be one of the greatest characters to ever grace a work of fiction.
I'm going with you. Chris is our old partner, you know.
What is it?
Blood.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things. Do you think we could see Tyrant now?
Barry, you're so optimistic.
Back to the actual story though, as players explore the mansion, they'll come across various documents detailing what was going on here. You'll slowly piece together that there were some sort of strange experiments going on in a secret lab beneath the mansion, and that some sort of virus was somehow leaked from said lab, infecting just about everyone who was here working on it. As the story progresses, more and more details are made clear, Like the fact that whoever was doing all this was trying to intentionally create monsters to use as biological weapons, and that the virus from the lab was leaked intentionally as part of a plan to gather test data on these weapons by luring S.T.A.R.S into the mansion to fight them. Once players make it inside the basement lab near the end of the game, they'll learn that the owners of this lab are a pharmaceutical company called Umbrella. Along with that, players will also find a presentation down here detailing every bioweapon that they've created in the lab, and at the end of this presentation, we can see a member of the S.T.A.R.S Alpha team alongside the other researchers, that being Albert Wesker. This leads to a confrontation with Wesker at the end of the game, where if you're playing as Jill, you'll also learn that Wesker had been blackmailing Barry throughout the entirety of the game by holding his wife and daughter hostage and forcing him to eliminate all evidence of Wesker's involvement with the lab, as well as lure Jill into various traps to gather more data on the bioweapons. It's here that Wesker explains that Umbrella was working on something they call the T-Virus, which was intended to create the ultimate life form. He tells us that said life form is in the next room, bringing us in to meet the Tyrant for ourselves. Wesker will then unleash the Tyrant on the player, leading into a climactic final battle with it at the bottom of the lab. Once you've managed to defeat it though, the facility's self-destruct will activate, and players will need to rush to the surface to escape. Along the way, you'll get a radio signal from our helicopter pilot Brad, asking if anyone can hear him. So we run up to the lab's helipad and set off a flare to call for a rescue. But just as Brad arrives to pick you up, the Tyrant breaks through the floor, revealing itself to still be alive and challenging you to one final battle. So we fight the Tyrant once again in what seems like an unwinnable fight until Brad finally drops us a rocket launcher that we use to blow the Tyrant to bits. We then board the helicopter and escape from the mansion just before the self-destruct blows the place sky high, erasing whatever evidence there was of the experiments going on there. Depending on certain actions throughout your playthrough though, the ending you get can actually change somewhat. Certain things that I just described may or may not play out exactly as they did for me, as the game is secretly keeping track of your actions at specific moments in the campaign, with all of those factors changing how the final sequence plays out in various ways. There are 8 different endings in the game in total, meaning that it's actually very likely that you'll see something slightly different every time you come back to revisit the game. Like I said before, the concept of Resident Evil's story is really strong, and the execution is there the majority of the time, but the voice acting can make it a little hard to take seriously at times. If you're able to look past the incredibly cheesy performances, I really do think there's a lot of value to it. The way that the game sets up this mystery for you to uncover and then slowly gives you one detail at a time is really well done, even by today's standards, and even more so when you consider that this is a title from 1996. And even with its bad performances, it's kind of impossible to not find yourself absolutely falling in love with the characters by the end of the game. The story isn't the main focus of the game, with it often taking a back seat to things like gameplay and exploration, but it does a great job at keeping you interested throughout your playthrough, and definitely sets itself up for some great potential sequels. But with all that now being discussed, should you play Resident Evil for yourself if you haven't already? Well, if you're asking me, hell yeah, you should. I obviously have a little bias here, but Resident Evil is genuinely still one of the greatest horror games I've ever played. Once you get past the game's clunky controls and high difficulty, you'll find yourself playing a game that's more immersive and dripping with atmosphere than even the majority of modern horror games, and its influence on the horror genre is one that's still felt to this day. Whether you're someone who's looking to get into the survival horror genre, a general horror game fan, or even a Resident Evil fan who's only ever played the remake, I would say that you owe it to yourself to experience the beginnings of one of the largest gaming franchises of the last 30 years. I remembered this game being pretty damn good, and after doing an additional 2 playthroughs to record for this video, my mind hasn't been changed at all. So with all that being said, go out and play some Resident Evil. Hey guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end. As you can imagine, this video was equal parts exciting and intimidating for me to make just because of how important the game is to me, but I'm really happy with how it came out and I hope you all enjoyed it. If videos like this one are your thing and you want to join the amazing group of people who make this all possible, maybe check out my Patreon where you can get things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. Anyway, I'm gonna get back to work on the next one, so thank you all again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.